In this episode, we're going to take a step beyond checking whether a control is present and instead focus on whether it actually works in the way you think it does. Many cloud security failures happen because a team believes a control is in place, but a misconfiguration leaves a gap that still allows the risky behavior the control was supposed to stop. That gap can be subtle, like a logging setting that misses critical events, a permission rule that seems tight but includes a wildcard, or an identity policy that can be bypassed through a legacy pathway. Validating control effectiveness means testing what the environment will actually permit, especially in edge cases where misconfigurations often hide. This is not about running attacks or teaching someone how to break in, but about thinking like a careful verifier who asks what could still happen even if the control looks enabled. When you learn to reason this way, you stop trusting labels and start trusting evidence, which is exactly what both exam questions and real security reviews demand. The goal is to build a clear mental model of how to test controls conceptually and how to interpret what misconfigurations still allow in terms of risk and remediation. Before we continue, a quick note. This audio course is a companion to our course companion books. The first book is about the exam and provides detailed information on how to pass it best. The second book is a Kindle-only ebook that contains 1,000 flashcards that can be used on your mobile device or Kindle. Check them both out at cyber.author.me in the Bare Metal Study Guide series. A useful definition is that a control is effective when it reliably produces its intended security outcome across normal usage and predictable abnormal usage. For example, an access control is effective when unauthorized identities cannot access sensitive resources, even when they try common variations like different request paths or indirect access through related services. A logging control is effective when important actions are captured consistently, stored safely, and can be used to reconstruct events during an investigation. A network exposure control is effective when the service is reachable only from intended networks and not accidentally from the public internet. Misconfigurations break effectiveness by creating exceptions, gaps, or weak defaults that still allow the undesired behavior. Beginners often stop at presence, like encryption is enabled or multi-factor authentication is on, but effectiveness asks whether the control truly covers the resources and actions you care about. That shift from presence to outcomes is the heart of this episode title. Testing effectiveness begins with defining the control objective in plain language, because you cannot test something if you cannot say what success looks like. If the objective is to prevent public access to storage, then success means that anonymous or unintended users cannot read or list the data. If the objective is to restrict administrative actions to approved identities, then success means that unapproved identities cannot perform those actions and cannot escalate privileges to become approved. If the objective is to maintain audit visibility, then success means the activity is recorded even when actions are performed quickly across different interfaces or through automation. Once you define success, you can ask what would count as failure, which is usually a specific type of access, change, or invisibility that should not be possible. This is where misconfigurations become visible conceptually, because misconfigurations usually create a failure condition that you can describe. For exam thinking, clear objectives help you choose the best validation approach, because it ties directly to what the control is meant to achieve. A common misunderstanding is thinking that validating effectiveness requires deep technical exploitation, when in many cases it is simply about checking coverage and pathways. Coverage means identifying whether the control applies to all relevant resources, all relevant identities, and all relevant interfaces. For example, a policy might apply to new resources but not to older ones, or it might apply to one region but not another. A permission boundary might apply to users but not to service identities, which can be a major gap if automation is powerful. An authentication requirement might apply to interactive logins, but not to API-based access, which attackers often prefer. Pathways refer to the different ways an action can be performed, such as direct access, indirect access via a linked service, or access through a role assumption or federation flow. You do not need to describe the mechanics in detail to understand the risk. If the control blocks one door but leaves a side door open, the control is not effective. Validation is the act of identifying those doors and confirming they are actually locked. Identity and access controls are often the most important area to validate because they sit at the center of cloud security. Misconfigurations here can allow privilege escalation, lateral movement, and broad access to data and infrastructure. Validating effectiveness in identity controls means checking whether permissions align with intended roles, whether there are overly broad grants, and whether sensitive actions require the right conditions. It also means checking whether there are pathways that bypass the main rules, like legacy authentication methods, outdated accounts, or trust relationships that are too permissive. The goal is to confirm that an identity without approval cannot still obtain access through indirect means, like assuming a role it should not be able to assume. You also want to validate that the controls apply consistently to both human users and automation identities, because attackers often target automation credentials. If a misconfiguration allows an identity to do more than intended, the control's presence does not matter because the outcome is still unsafe. Logging and monitoring controls also require validation because misconfigurations can create blind spots that are not obvious until after an incident. A logging setting might be enabled, but it might not include certain event categories, or it might not capture actions performed through specific interfaces. Logs might be generated but stored in a place where they can be deleted by the same identities you are trying to monitor, which weakens their integrity. Retention might be too short to support investigations, especially if detection is delayed, which is common. Validating effectiveness here means confirming that key activities are present in the records you rely on and that those records are protected and retained. You also want to confirm that alerts or review processes are aligned with the logs, because logs without any practical way to review them are less useful. The key idea is that visibility is a control outcome, and misconfigurations often reduce visibility without changing the appearance of being logged. Network exposure controls are another area where misconfigurations can undermine effectiveness while leaving the environment looking mostly normal. A service might be intended for internal access only, but a misconfigured rule could make it reachable from outside networks. Sometimes the exposure is not obvious because the service still requires authentication, so teams assume it is safe, but exposure increases attacker opportunity and can create new attack paths. Validation here means confirming reachability matches intent, which includes understanding the difference between being reachable and being usable. Even if a service cannot be fully accessed, attackers can still probe it, attempt authentication, and exploit vulnerabilities, so unintended reachability is still a risk. Misconfigurations can also occur when network rules are too broad for convenience, like allowing wide ranges or using permissive defaults. An effective control ensures that only intended sources can reach the service and that changes to exposure are deliberate and reviewed. Validation is about confirming that the barrier exists where you think it exists. Data protection controls, like encryption and access restrictions, also need effectiveness validation because misconfigurations can create the illusion of protection. Encryption might be enabled for some storage types, but not others, or enabled for data at rest, but not for data in transit between services. A key management approach might exist, but permissions to use keys might be too broad, allowing unintended decryption. Access policies might restrict reading data, but allow copying or sharing it through another pathway, which can still result in leakage. Validating effectiveness means confirming that sensitive data is actually protected across the lifecycle, including storage, access, and movement. It also means confirming that labels like encrypted align with meaningful protection, such as keys being controlled and audited. The exam often tests this by presenting scenarios where a control exists but is misconfigured, and the correct response involves checking whether the control truly covers the sensitive path. The student who understands effectiveness will choose answers that verify outcomes rather than trusting labels. Another important concept is testing boundary conditions, because misconfigurations often show up at the edges of normal behavior. Boundary conditions might include unusual resource names, unusual inheritance patterns and permissions, interactions between multiple policies, or situations where a control is supposed to apply but does not due to missing scope. For example, a policy might apply to one category of resources but not to a newly introduced service, leaving a gap that the organization did not anticipate. Or an access rule might allow a wildcard that unintentionally matches more resources than intended. These are not exotic hacker tricks. They are common configuration mistakes that happen when systems are complex and humans are busy. Validating effectiveness includes asking where the control might not apply and then confirming whether that gap exists. This is why control validation is not a one-time activity, because new services and new patterns of usage can create new edges. A mature approach keeps revisiting boundary conditions as the environment evolves. When a validation effort finds that a misconfiguration still allows risky behavior, the next step is to interpret what that allowance means in terms of actual risk. Not every gap is equally urgent, and the urgency depends on exposure, privilege level, and data sensitivity. If the misconfiguration allows a low-privilege action in a test environment with no sensitive data, it may be lower priority than a misconfiguration that allows privilege escalation or public access to sensitive storage. The key is to connect the allowed behavior to a plausible attack path and the potential impact. This is also where evidence matters, because you want to show not only that a setting is wrong, but that the wrong setting permits a specific outcome that violates the control objective. That kind of evidence makes remediation more compelling and reduces debates about whether the finding is theoretical. It also helps you prioritize fixes that reduce meaningful risk rather than focusing on cosmetic compliance. The overall mindset is that controls are promises, and validation is how you confirm the promises are true. Benchmark checks and configuration reviews tell you what the environment claims to be, but effectiveness testing tells you what the environment will allow in practice. You define the control objective, identify the pathways and coverage areas that matter, and look for gaps where misconfigurations weaken the outcome. You focus on identity, logging, network exposure, and data protection because these are common places where misconfigurations create real incidents. You also pay attention to boundary conditions and evolving services because cloud environments change in ways that can quietly invalidate old assumptions. When you find gaps, you translate them into risk by describing the allowed behavior and why it matters. On an exam, this approach helps you pick answers that emphasize verifying outcomes, catching bypass paths, and using evidence rather than assumptions. In real cloud security work, it builds resilience because you stop trusting the word enabled and start trusting the reality of what the environment will actually permit.
Thanks for listening. For more audio courses, daily newsletters, and more, please visit DailyCyber.News.